When you've got questions, he always has an answer. It's Sean Hannity, this afternoon at 2, right before Joe Walsh at 5 on AM 560. The Answer.
Last week, Michelle Obama sat down with the Today Show after
She's
Eric
gorgeous.
Stunning. After Eric Holder and Hillary Clinton's pronouncements against civility in the context of politics, Michelle Obama had this to say.
What would you say now about your motto? Do you think it still stands when they go low, you go high?
Absolutely. Fear is not it's not a proper motivator.
Important point that she makes, although not in the cheap political way that she meant it. Fear is not a good motivator. It's true. So how do you overcome fear? My sense has always been that nice little phrasing, no God, no fear. KNO, no God, no fear. No God, NO, no God, no fear, KNO.
Got it.
KNOW, I should say. Sorry for my Dan Quayle spelling lesson. Al
Yeah,
Sharpton,
potato.
RESPICT. So when you have a relationship with God,
Yes.
you can transform and overcome your fears because you understand, who you're living to give glory to. She means it in the cheap political context. And she wants the state to be the resolver, the dispenser of all fears. And this seems to me to be a big divide when we talk about civility in our discourse, when we talk about elevating the discourse, when we talk about having adult conversations in the political arena. And so sort of like as this continues to unwind and you see fights on the streets of Portland between, I don't know, myriad groups. Hard to Antifa and anti-Antifa and anti-anti-Antifa, I don't know. As well as the vandalism we've seen during the Kavanaugh hearings, the Winnebago County Republican Party here in Rockford, threats posted after windows were broken at the New York GOP headquarters in Manhattan over the weekend. Obviously, the violence that's been part of our politics, from the shootings at the shooting at the Republican softball practice to Rand Paul being attacked on his lawn. People are starting to get the sense that this is, and then the Kavanaugh
that was
sideshow, that circus. People are getting the sense that our politics is getting away from us, right? And perhaps looking to recoil. So where do you find safe harbor? For more on that important topic, we're pleased to be joined by Russell Moore. He is the president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission for the Southern Baptist Convention, and he is also the author of the book, The Storm-Tossed Family, How the Cross Reshapes the Home. Russell Moore, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
How did you receive that moment last week when Pastor Andrew Brunson, who was released from being imprisoned in Turkey, political prisoner, visited the White House and knelt before the president and prayed with the president? It's an expression of faith that we rarely see in the public arena in our discussion of politics these days. And perhaps because he was a freed hostage, he had more standing and was given more latitude by the D.C. press corps than would somebody otherwise be. But I just wonder what your perspective on the importance of that moment was.
Well, I think it was important precisely because prayer had been at issue all along. There were millions of people praying for Pastor Brunson all over the world. I was talking just the other day to a group from Wheaton College in Illinois. Of course, he's an alum of that school, and they had been praying every single chapel service for him ever since he was captured. So prayer had been right at the root of this from the very beginning.
And how do you feel President Trump's role was in getting him released?
Well, I think that it was important. I think that a great deal of pressure had to be applied to Turkey, both publicly and privately. And of course, in any of these situations, both of those are important. There has to be public pressure. People can't forget about people who have been captured, and then there also has to be a great deal of work behind the scenes.
Your reflections now that there's been a few days of separation from what has come to pass, what came to pass during the Kavanaugh confirmation hearing. It's not going away. The Me Too movement, the Him Too movement now giving birth, the women's marches, and just sort of the tone and tenor of our politics.
Well, we're in a really sad time to the point that there's a great deal of growing cynicism. I think that's what I was worried about most last week, is that not so much that you had a large number of people thinking that one side was lying or the other side was lying. We're accustomed to that. But a great deal of Americans assuming that everybody's lying. That's going to be a real problem with our political discourse going forward. And I'm not sure how you can cohere as a nation with that level of cynicism.
How about even cohering as a family? Your book, The Storm-Tossed Family, How the Cross Reshapes the Home. I mean, the stories now, 2 years in, are legion about disagreements over Trump and our politics breaking up, or certainly creating a distance between family members, between loved ones.
Well, yes, and I think that's increasing to some degree, but it's not new. And so part of being in a family is having to deal with constant perils all the time when it comes to seeing things differently. And that's one of the reasons why family becomes so it kind of reveals who we are, because we lose our sense of self-ruling, of governing everything around us and of control of everything around us, because I can't control what Uncle Ronnie thinks at the Thanksgiving table. I have to figure out how to deal with him at that moment, and I can't control what my child says once that child is grown. I have to decide how am I going to respond to that.
Well, you were a prominent anti-Trump voice during the campaign. How do you feel President Trump has performed so far in the first 2 years?
Well, I think all of us, regardless of what we think about the president, ought to be praying that he succeeds, because in every good thing, because the country needs to succeed. So my role right now, as someone is president, no matter who is president, is to pray for that person and to hope for God's guidance.
What about male-female relations, even outside of the family, or outside and then becomes inside the family? Just in the wake of Kavanaugh, of Me Too, of the questions about whether due process and presumptions of innocence should be legal, should be cultural norms in addition to legal standards. How concerned are you about that? How does that factor into strong families and strong bonds of community?
Well, one of the main things that I worry about right now is the fact that I'm working in any given day with people who have survived sexual assault and sexual abuse, and also working within the criminal justice system with people who have been falsely accused of various crimes. And so we have to, in all of these sort of cultural, political debates that take place, we have to be mindful of who's going to be overhearing what it is that we're saying. And so you can have people hearing on the one hand, well, this doesn't really matter, who have survived awful sexual predation and are wondering, can I come forward and will anyone believe me? And we have people who are swept away in an unjust sort of accusation that we have to make sure they hear that we're going to deal fairly and wisely with your situation as well. So I think there are often real life implications that we just don't think about when everything turns into kind of a cable news video game.
Do you feel, or does it give you great pause when you think about young men in America and how they might not have a right to due process, that just simple accusation could destroy their lives?
Well, I don't see much of that taking place. I'm more concerned right now by the fact that what I more typically deal with are people, male and female, who have have been sexually assaulted. And when they go forward, either in their workplace or sadly, sometimes even in their church, it's treated more as a public relations issue than as an issue of justice. And those people are simply moved along. I think that's one of the things that we're seeing right now with the horror coming out of the Pittsburgh Archdiocese of Pittsburgh report of a church structure that dealt with sexual assault and sexual immorality and predation in ways that were more about public relations than they were about what's right and wrong.
We have that same thing going on in Chicago with the Chicago public school system and a series of investigative reports by the Chicago Tribune, and it's rather depressing how little sort of sustained coverage and attention, excuse me, it's receiving. So there's no question what you're saying is true, but then there's this other phenomenon that seems to me more recent, and it was sort of highlighted by this piece in the New York Times over the weekend. A founder of a progressive new blog, media outlet, who was on this list of 70 people that had been posted by somebody of bad guys in the media. He falsely accused of rape, and he files this defamation suit against her, and it was much after much thought to do so, because he's worried about the backlash. You're supposed to just the left's perspective is just believe women, and even if you're not guilty of what you're accused of doing, then you take one for the team. And literally 5 other guys who spoke to the New York Times on the condition of anonymity said of this lawsuit that even though they were also not guilty of what they had been charged with by being named on this list, they didn't like his defamation lawsuit because you're supposed to take one for the team these days. I mean, the idea of throwing your reputation and perhaps your life and your career prospects away to quote-unquote take one for the team. What are the teams? That's a bizarre dynamic that's occurring, and these are men and women of the left that are sort of discussing this and this approach to accusations.
Well, I mean, I don't know about that case in particular, but I do know that one of our larger problems that we have in American life is that sense of teams and that sense of finding my ultimate identity in some sort of tribe, in a way that is not what God has called us to do. He's called us to find our identity ultimately in Christ and in the church that Christ has established. And so when that's moved away, then you're going to have people who are really going to make a religion out of whatever cultural ideology or political movement that they find themselves in.
And is the thesis of your book, The Storm-Tossed Family, is what precisely?
Well, there are a lot of people who think that when they're facing difficulties and struggles in family, that means that somehow God is distant from them. When in reality, every family relationship is going to be a place of spiritual warfare and of great struggle. And so the struggle is real, and the struggle is worth it, though. And so whatever aspect of life you're facing, whether that's singleness or marriage or parenting or dealing with an elderly parent that you're caregiving for, there's going to be difficulty, and press through. You're not alone in that.
All right. He is Russell Moore, president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission for the Southern Baptist Convention. The book, The Storm-Tossed Family, How the Cross Reshapes the Home. Russell Moore, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And he joined us on our Turnkey.Pro answer